Hello and welcome to this online lesson on the Vietnam War, specifically the period of escalation under President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now if you'd like to, you can pause this video here and do the Do Now task. Many Americans supported US policy towards Vietnam, at least early on. If US troops got sent to Vietnam, how might this, firstly, increase support for the war, and secondly, decrease support for the war? Try to identify reasons for both. Once you've done that, you may have identified some of the following reasons. It might increase support of the war because of patriotism. People might see the need to support their troops who are going into harm's way, even if they didn't agree with the war itself. Secondly, it may decrease support for the war because of the human cost of actually sending American soldiers out to fight in Vietnam, to die in Vietnam, and also potentially to commit acts which would be very controversial and disliked at home. So there's plenty of different answers you could have come up with that, and I hope it's got you thinking. Right, on to some key terms now. So today's entries in Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words you need to know are escalation. This means to make something more intense or more serious. Secondly, retaliation, fighting back. And thirdly, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is a key act of Congress from 1964, which allowed the US to send troops to take part in the Vietnam War directly. Remember, previous to this point in 1964, US troops had been involved either secretly or indirectly. For example, the Green Berets being sent to build the Strategic Hamlets program, and also CIA-trained pilots operating South Vietnamese aircraft. So your tasks are to record the key terms and their meanings. And secondly, what reasons might be given by the US government for escalating the Vietnam War? If you'd like to do that, pause the video now. Considering task 2, what reasons might be given by the US government for escalating the Vietnam War? Well, let's have a think. Possibly, it could be because of attacks on US soldiers. Remember as well the belief in domino theory. This is something that was quite common under Eisenhower's leadership. Remember, he supported the South Vietnamese government because he was worried about the spread of communism, one country falling to communism and then the next and another, much like a row of dominoes. And this was something that was continued by Kennedy, although he was much more reluctant to get directly involved in the fighting. There are other reasons you may come up with as well, and just consider those as we go through the lesson and see if you were right. Let's consider why the Viet Cong was such a threat in 1964. A reminder that the Viet Cong are not the same thing as the North Vietnamese Army, although the North Vietnamese Army did support them. The Viet Cong were essentially communist rebels in South Vietnam. They were fighting the South Vietnamese government in order to install their own communist government and ultimately to reunify both North and South Vietnam into one country. First of all, their organisation. The NLF provided a political leadership structure. North Vietnam sent more people to organise resistance. And finally, the Viet Cong were organised into cadres which were divided into three-man cells which could act very quickly. Consider how bureaucratic and slow large armies like ARVN and the US Army were compared to a three-man cell reacting very instantaneously to local circumstances. Secondly, they had local support. The Viet Cong controlled areas introduced social reforms. These included replacing corrupt government officials who were deeply unpopular with the rural communities. Secondly, they respected villagers and often involved them in decision making. Much as this implicated some villagers into Viet Cong activities, it did make them feel like they were part of the same struggle. Some Viet Cong lived with the villagers themselves and shared their hardships. This gained them sympathy. Thirdly, the Viet Cong ideals. Viet Cong propaganda stressed that they were fighting the USA and its puppet government. Remember this idea that the South Vietnamese government was simply a puppet of the US administration. Sure, by this point Diem has been assassinated, but the South Vietnamese government is still seen very much under US control. Secondly, to end injustice and poverty in the rural areas, particularly of South Vietnam. And finally, to unite Vietnam with a fair government of their choosing. Thirdly, time. The Viet Cong had time on their side. It was their country and it didn't matter how long it took to win. Ultimately, the Americans would eventually get tired of being involved in South Vietnam. That was not a problem that the Viet Cong were going to face. Second to last, the South Vietnamese government. Villagers resented being moved into strategic hamlets. A crucial misunderstanding of this was the expectation that these villages wanted to be moved away into so-called safe villages when they had such a spiritual and social connection to their landscape, to where their ancestors were buried, for example. The government was seen as a puppet of the USA, which we've mentioned before, and also the government was split by infighting and not focused on beating the Viet Cong. And lastly, foreign aid. Communist China and the USSR, so that's Communist Russia, provided weapons, advisors and troops. The Viet Cong could make larger and more damaging attacks. Remember, the same way that the USA wanted to prevent the spread of communism by domino theory, communist countries like China and the USSR wanted the opposite. They were very keen for communism to gain more traction and to spread to new countries. That's why when you see the military equipment of the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies, they use Chinese-built and often Russian-designed weapons, like the AK-47 Kalashnikov rifles, which are so iconic. So, based upon this, choose any 3 of these reasons. You can do more if you wish, but choose any 3 reasons why the Viet Cong was such a threat. Explain why this made them a threat using point, example, explain. As an extension, what developments could make them more of a threat? What might make them less? Pause the video here and complete the task. Okay, done? Let's move on. Now this is a really key event, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You may want to write this down as a subheading in your work. President Johnson wanted to get Congress to approve the use of US troops in Vietnam, but as things stood, they would not. This was about to change. 2 US destroyers, the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy, were mounting patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin. On the 2nd of August, Maddox spotted 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats or torpedo boats on their radar. The North Vietnamese fired. The Maddox fired back and then called in air support. If you want to know what the Maddox looked like, that's a photograph of it in the top right. On August the 4th, during a bad storm, Maddox and Sea Turner Joy reported a Vietnamese attack and claimed to have sunk 2 torpedo boats. Later, in the confusion, Johnson was told that there may not have been an attack at all. It seems rather that in the low visibility, some of the waves and some of the weather conditions were giving false readings on the radar of these destroyers. And given the events of 2 days earlier, the crews of the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy were particularly trigger happy and understandably nervous. So, Johnson was told that there may not have been an attack at all. US planes launched a retaliation, so a fight back, on North Vietnam. 2 planes were shot down in that air raid. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about this event, I've included in the description a link to a video by Simple History, which outlines the events of the Gulf of Tonkin incident really well. You might want to pause this video here and revisit it once you've seen that. If not, you can carry on with these tasks. Firstly, you will need to create a timeline from August the 2nd to August the 7th of 1964. An ideal scale for this would be 4 centimetres equals 1 day, so ultimately you'll be drawing a 20 centimetre line. Bear in mind that on the next slide of this presentation there will be more events. Secondly, add the events of the 2nd of August and August the 4th to your timeline. Thirdly, and as an extension, why did Johnson order an airstrike if there was confusion over the incident? Now remember, Johnson knew that there was confusion and that the attack was not confirmed. He chose to send those planes in anyway. Why might he do this? Alright, pause the video here. Once you've completed those tasks, you can move on. Alright, now that's been done, perhaps you've been considering why Johnson may have authorised those airstrikes. Well, remember, Johnson is in favour of escalating the war so he can get it over quickly anyway. So this might just be seen as the first in a line of excuses that will allow him to send more of America's military might towards North Vietnam with a view to defeating them. Now we need to consider the later consequences and later events of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, this second part is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So remember this from our keywords earlier. This was an agreement and an act within Congress to authorise American troops to fight in Vietnam. On August the 5th, Johnson told Congress about the attack on the Maddox and Sea Turner Joy. He asked Congress to give him the power to prevent further attacks on US forces. And now that's quite vague and it's slightly euphemistic. He's not really saying what he means there. The power to prevent further attacks on US forces would effectively give him a much wider scope of the sort of action that he could take in Vietnam. 2 days later, on August the 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This authorised Johnson to take any steps necessary to prevent attacks on US forces, including the bombing of North Vietnam and sending US troops into South Vietnam. It did not officially declare war on North Vietnam, and that's a pretty crucial thing here. Without officially declaring war, it's an attempt to prevent the further escalation and spread of the war. If, for example, North Vietnam were able to get the formal Allied response of places like China and the USSR, you could very well have had World War III on your hands. This was something that nobody wanted. So although it was quite clear at this point that the Americans were going to take a much bigger role in the active fighting in Vietnam, rather than just skirting around on the edges, it is not a formal declaration of war. And that's a controversial but very important point. Revisit your timelines. Add these new events to your timeline. Then use point, example, explain to explain why you think Congress approved this resolution. As an extension, why didn't the USA declare war? Well, consider what I've told you, but also what you know about the politics in the area. Does this resolution have the same effect as declaring a war? Pause this video here, complete the tasks, and then we'll move on. Done? Alright, well, considering point 2, why might Congress have approved the resolution? Well, remember that Johnson's party, the Democrats, controlled Congress at this time, and by and large they're likely to support their president. But within Congress there was a popular feeling that if the USA were able to get further involved in the Vietnam War, then it could be finished quickly. Now, many times in history we have seen great nations get involved in wars that then drag on for years and years, and you would think that people would learn from this. But given the circumstances of the time, and given America's military confidence and how much they felt that they could outgun their opponents, this would have seemed like quite a realistic prospect to many people in Congress. Moving on. Let's consider the key features of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964. Firstly, there was an attack by the North Vietnamese on the 2nd of August. Secondly, at the start of the evening of the 4th of August, Maddox and C. Turner Joy thought they were under attack. Thirdly, Johnson ordered airstrikes despite doubts over this attack. Fourthly, Congress passed the resolution believing that there were 2 attacks. Fifthly, the resolution allowed Johnson to do what he thought was needed to defend South Vietnam. And lastly, the resolution escalated the war, but it did not declare war on North Vietnam. Here's some tasks to consolidate this knowledge. Firstly, add a sentence or two for each of the following headings. What did the crews of the Maddox and C. Turner Joy think was happening? Secondly, what was Johnson told? C. How did Johnson react? D. What was Congress told? And finally, how did Congress react to what they were told? Task 2. It considers this statement. President Johnson lied to Congress. Right, that's just an opinion. Let's see whether you agree with it. A. Do you agree with this statement? Use point, example, explain to explain your point of view. B. Use point, example, explain to explain an alternative point of view. This might be one that you yourself disagree with. And lastly, as an extension, what motive might Johnson have had to be dishonest, if indeed he was? Pause the video here and complete those tasks. Done? Alright, well, let's see how well we've understood it. Here are the key features of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution again, except this time I've deliberately included some inaccuracies. See if you can spot them. Firstly, there was an attack by the North Vietnamese on the 2nd of August. Secondly, at the start of the evening on the 4th of August, Maddox and C. Turner Joy were attacked a second time. Thirdly, Johnson ordered airstrikes. Fourthly, Congress passed the resolution believing that there were 2 attacks. Fifthly, the resolution allowed Johnson to do what he thought was needed to defend South Vietnam. And lastly, the USA declared war on North Vietnam. Alright, let's summarise your knowledge. Read the statements again, which are true and which are false. Pause the video now and have a go. Right, did you identify them? The first lie is where it says, at the start of the evening of the 4th of August, Maddox and C. Turner Joy were attacked a second time. This is not true. They thought they were attacked, but it's absolutely unclear whether they were or not. It is most likely that they were never actually attacked a second time. The other lie is that the USA declared war on North Vietnam. Remember, this did not happen for fear of escalating the war further into a wider world war. Now have a go at task 2. Would you say that Johnson lied to Congress? Explain what you think. Now think about the information that Johnson had at his disposal. Think about what is known and what was only supposed or possible to have happened. And then think about what Congress were actually told. There's no wrong answer to this especially, and to be truthful, it's unlikely that this will be settled by historians anytime soon. But let's see what you think. Pause the video now and complete task 2. Done? Alright, let's move to the end. Finally, what were the immediate effects of escalation? From August 1964, the numbers of American soldiers in Vietnam steadily increased. From 1965, American bombers targeted North Vietnam in a continuous campaign called Rolling Thunder. Let's consider this exam question. I'm going to show you 2 diagrams. Explain 2 consequences of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now I've put an 8 mark in brackets there because this is very similar to a paper 2 question in which you will have to explain 2 consequences. You choose 2 examples and explain what their results were. Diagram number 1. In 1964, the USA spent $400 to $500 million on their efforts in Vietnam. They sent 23,300 troops and 216 of them were killed. Let's have a look at diagram number 2, which shows the similar stats for 1965. In 1965, the US spent $700 million on the Vietnam War. They sent 184,300 troops and 1,923 servicemen and women were killed. Consider those facts, consider what the consequences are of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and use any of those statistics that you think might be helpful. Pause the video now if you'd like to have a go at that. Okay, now you've finished that, let's consider what these consequences might be. One of the things you might have identified is how much more money was being spent on the Vietnam War. Consider that after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Johnson was being given all the powers that he wanted in order to escalate the war. This would cost money, and this is shown in the figures given. A similar point can be made about the number of troops being sent. Now the Americans can more openly send combat troops to Vietnam. This no longer has to be done via the back door by sending special forces like the Green Berets building the strategic hamlets. Now regular infantry and marines and air crews can be sent to South Vietnam to act as actual combat troops. And that results in our final consequence, 1,923 dead. This was a figure that was only going to grow and grow and grow. And yet, when we compare this to the figure for 1964, we can see that far more American soldiers are being sent into harm's way as a result of what Congress decided with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So in summary, finally, what were the immediate effects of escalation? One consequence of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was the vast increase in the numbers of US troops sent to Vietnam. 23,300 troops were sent in 1964 compared to 184,300 in 1965. A second consequence of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was that Congress had given political approval for Johnson to escalate the war. This meant that Johnson could order the bombing of North Vietnam by American aircraft. This bombing campaign, known as Rolling Thunder, will be the focus of a future lesson. Stay tuned for that one there. I hope that this has been useful. Do go back and review any of the slides that you need to do. And if you want to have more of this content to help you with your studies, just like and subscribe to this channel. Thanks very much. I'll be back with more soon. Bye-bye.